When you look at these images, you just know that them early days of Formula 1 were strange times. And yeah, the pit stop boys may look at this crusty old footage and think,
Actual racing? I don't give a fuck.
but y'all who know the sport know that for some of the better, more interesting, more messed up stories in the sport, you've got to head back to a time where people drove without seatbelts, there were still tracks made of wood, and people where they drank. What a time to be a racing fan. In 1951, there were only 8 rounds in that year's F1 championship. Only 3 were on permanent racetracks, and because one of them was the Indianapolis 500, and it was run within mere days of the Swiss Grand Prix, no driver ever did the full 8 rounds. It also meant that half the tracks used that year were technically street circuits. So, take that, people who say that we've got too many street circuits nowadays. We're merely going back to our roots. Of these 8 rounds, however, we're only going to focus on one. It was in northern France, in Reims. On the 1st of July, the track played host to the French Grand Prix, as well as the European Grand Prix. It was the exact same race, but promoters back then gave races more titles than Godzilla movies. Although, rather than having 2 monsters go at each other, the battle of that July day was between Ferrari and Alfa Romeo, a time where Italy dominated Grand Prix racing. Both teams had all the best drivers in the world, and everything in between going for them, as opposed to the Talbot Lagos, which were too slow, and the Simca Gordinis, which always broke down before they had a chance to show how slow they were. It was a nice hot summer day in northern France, almost ideal conditions for racing, especially back then when the cars were, to put it one way, well ventilated. Pole position was taken by the Alfa Romeo of Juan Manuel Fangio, an annoyingly common sight. They didn't call this guy El Maestro for nothing. In second was the guy that beat him to the world title the year prior, Nino Farina. What was the gap between the two? Well, put it to you this way, the gap between first and last in Q1 of the 2023 Bahrain Grand Prix, 1.2 seconds. The gap between first and second in the 1951 French Grand Prix, 1.7 seconds. Yeah, racing was way closer back in the day. Field spread back then was measured using calendars. Anyways, the Ferraris and the Alfa Romeos annihilated the field, taking the top 7 places, the straggler of the bunch being Luigi Fagioli. For all those that uttered, "Who is Luigi Fagioli?" The mad disrespect. He was a veteran Grand Prix driver who started racing back in 1926. By 1951, however, he was seasoned. Just a couple weeks prior, he celebrated his 53rd birthday by virtue of being born in a time when Arthur Morgan was still alive. The idea of a 53-year-old frail, wizened man racing in Formula 1 is ludicrous nowadays, but the man they called the Abruzzi Robber could still hang with the best of them, and to this day, he maintains the second highest podium percentage in the history of Formula 1. Which is extremely interesting, but it hadn't been a long time since he won his last Grand Prix, the Monaco Grand Prix. 16 years earlier. He likely weren't going to win today because he qualified 7.4 seconds slower than Fangio. Probably not a reflection of how he was as a driver. Fangio was the guy in that team. He got all the preferential treatment, but hey, who knows? Maybe his car will blow up. It is Italian after all. The green flag drops and Fangio shoots off into the lead. Same old 70,000 spectators in the crowd have come to see the Argentine GOAT run around for 77 laps to another victory, although the Ferrari behind him had other ideas. He may have looked like a warthog, but Alberto Ascari was the only real threat to Fangio in this time. By the end of the first lap, he passed him for the lead, and now we really did have a race on our hands here. It was all going grand, but the Reims circuit was notoriously tough on cars, and with a Ferrari leading the race, that fairy tale could never last. With 10 laps in the books, it was Ascari leading from Fangio, Luigi Villorisi, and in his first ever Formula 1 race, Big Gonzo. Wait, hang on, what's that sound? Oh no, it's Ascari's Ferrari breaking down. The gearbox had seized and that was that. Fangio was back in the lead, and with Villorisi moving into second, Alfa Romeo were in complete control of the race. It sounds really weird to say that nowadays, but hey, nothing between these 2 years is comparable. Fangio was running away to victory until his car developed a misfire. He headed for the pit lane. The mechanics looked over it, worked their magic, and sent him on his way. But immediately, it was obvious that the mercurial Italian engineers had indeed attempted to use actual magic to fix his Alfa Romeo. Oh well, worth a try. He returned to the pit lane to have the issue fixed via conventional means. But this meant that he started to lose lap after lap as the time trickled down, and his opponents were still circulating. All of this meant that Nino Farina was leading the race from Villorisi and Old Man driver in third, Luigi Fagioli. Despite being seasoned, he started to claw his way forward and was making good headway. He came into the pit lane for more fuel, and while he was there, the team manager tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Get out. We're putting Fangio in this car." Now, back in the day, teams were allowed to swap drivers in the middle of the race. The drivers would have to split the points, but for the teams, wins were what mattered. A driver's points and literal mortality, not so much. So, there was Fagioli being forced to give up his car whilst in a good position, a position to potentially win the race. But knowing he was under contract, Fagioli stepped out, rather reluctantly, and handed the car over to Fangio, whose smouldering heat was given to Fagioli. Oh geez, thanks lads, I always wanted one of these things. After all, what is an Alfa Romeo without smoke emanating from it? The gall of these guys to treat him with such a level of disrespect enraged the Abruzzi robber. And I mean, can you really blame him? Ferrari saw Alfa Romeo hot swapping their drivers and thus told Big Gonzo to hand his car over to Ascari. Given Gonzalez was a new boy, he didn't mind taking a knee for the evil empire. But despite Ferrari's best driver now at the helm, the fact was this: Fangio was right behind him in a healthy car, in a fast car, and he was gunning it. He broke the lap record over and over and over again. He ended up setting a lap record 8 seconds faster than the one previously set. Juan Manuel Fangio was proving right here and there why he was one of the greatest drivers the world had ever seen. Farina was still leading until he came in for his pit stop where nothing happened. He went back out and continued on his merry way, leading the Grand Prix. And then his tyre blew. Then he came in for an unscheduled pit stop, and that's when things turned catastrophically Italian. This gave the lead to Ascari before his car encountered brake problems. He came into pit, and Fangio went back into first place. And he would keep that first place for the remainder of the race, and would bring home the dub for Alfa Romeo. The rules being what they were, it meant that there were 5 drivers on that freaking podium, and that Fangio's win would be shared with Fagioli. This made Luigi Fagioli, at the age of 53 years, and 22 days old, the oldest Formula 1 Grand Prix winner of all time, but a Formula 1 Grand Prix winner no less, and he was beyond pissed off. He knew he wasn't the driver that he once was, but to be told to make way for another driver was the biggest insult of all. This was his first Grand Prix win, but it would also be his last, and it would also be his last Formula 1 race ever, because after this fiasco, he quit. Despite this acrimonious departure, his legacy does still remain. No driver has ever won a Grand Prix at a more seasoned age. In fact, it's not even close, and he still maintains the second highest podium percentage of all time in Formula 1, right behind Dino Serafini. Wait, who the f*** is Dino Serafini?